Some years ago, I was travelling with some friends and we went first to London, and I suspect that I'd caught something on the plane. So it was totally a case of man flu. It was nothing serious, but of course that meant that I was prostrate, horizontal, feeling very unwell. We were staying in a convent in London, and I think the sisters must have put like a mark up on the door and they stayed well away, right? But my friends were trying to look after me, and even to this day when I think about it, I'm just filled with embarrassment about it, because I was just a terrible patient. I was awful, like just rude and wanted people to stay away from me, and I was just, all I wanted to do was lie there and get better, but I also kind of I knew I needed to be looked after a little bit as well. And it was just like, to this, still very good friends with this couple to this day, and every now and then it comes up and I just want to crawl into a hole and die because I'm still ashamed about it. The reason why I mention it is because there's something about being sick, and as I said, it was a man flu, right? Like you can be much more seriously unwell than this, and maybe less unwell too. There's something about being sick that is alienating, where we do feel disconnected. I know there are some people when they're sick, they just want they want a little bell to ring and someone to come at their bidding all the time. But I think even with that, there's something in us that kind of wants that attention but runs away from it or avoids it, that finds ourselves going, I just feel disconnected in some way with others at that time. It can often be like there can be real tension in the moment as well. Okay? Now, in the time of Jesus, they obviously didn't have the same understanding that we do about how illness is transmitted, but they knew enough to know that if you were close to somebody with leprosy, and leprosy gets defined these days very tightly, it really in the time of Jesus meant any kind of skin disease, any kind of visible affliction. And some of those are very contagious. And so the people of Israel knew enough to stay away. Right back in the book of Leviticus, which we heard in the first reading, there are all these prescriptions about what somebody with leprosy had to do. They had to keep a real distance from others. They were actually ostracized. They were actually kept away. They couldn't come into the same parts of town. In the time of Jesus, they would walk with a bell shouting out, "Unclean, unclean," so people knew to stay away from them. Thanks be to God, we've come a lot further than that, right? We don't do that in quite the same way with people, but there's still something where we just feel separated or distanced or isolated from others when we're unwell. In the time of Jesus, there was also a very live question about part of the cause of sickness as well, and that was that if you were sick, perhaps it was because you had sinned, that it was a punishment for your sin that you would be sick. And Jesus very explicitly and clearly deals with that in John's Gospel in particular. He says unequivocally, remember there's the story of the man born blind, we're going to hear it in a few weeks' time. The story of the man born blind, they ask the question, well, why is it that this guy is blind? Is it his sin or is it his parents' sin? Because they sometimes thought that it was passed on from one generation to the next. And Jesus says really clearly, it was neither of those things. It was neither of those things. Sickness is not a result of sin. But I do think that there's an experience of illness and sickness where even though we might not have done something wrong, something that separates us from God, we still feel distant from God too often when we're sick. A time when we would expect perhaps God to be looking after us and feel like he's close, we can feel like God seems further away or harder to experience his love and care in those times as well. And I'm sure that's part of why they made the connection. And so even though Jesus breaks that connection, says, look, if you get sick, it's not because you've done the wrong thing, okay, because you've sinned. There is something alienating about our experience of being ill in relationship to God as well. So all of that makes illness, sickness of various sorts and stripes tricky, difficult times for us. You don't have to be a big sook like me when I was sick to actually experience some of those effects, okay? Some of those experiences. So that gives us a little bit of context for what happens in the gospel today when this leper comes up to Jesus. And he says to him, to Jesus, if you want to, you can cure me. If you want to, you can heal me. Now that's really significant, isn't it? Because what you hear there is the leper saying really clearly, I have no doubt that you can do this. If you can heal me. It's whether you want to or not. Now the leper couldn't have had the same faith that we do now. He couldn't have professed faith in Jesus as the second person of the Trinity made flesh. He didn't have the faith to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. He couldn't have known that. But he believed at least that Jesus was a healer, okay? But it raises an important question for us, I think, or an important moment for us in our reflection. And it's about how we see God relating to us. What is God's want, if you like? What is God's desire towards us? The leper says, if you want to, you can do this for me. You can heal me. How do you see God relating to you? Because often, I think, there's a really live question there inside us where we can be thinking to ourselves, God, do you really care about me? Are you really interested in my welfare? Are you quick to judge, quick to punish? Do you kind of look at me and go, oh, look, he's all right some of the time, but geez, a disappointment a chunk of the time? How is it that you conceive of God and his gaze, as it were, what he wants, what he's looking for you? We get an indication of Jesus' response here, of God's response, because we're told that Jesus, the translation limps terribly. It says that Jesus felt sorry for him. It's an awful translation of the word. What that word there that's translated as sorry is that Jesus was moved in the depths of his being. It's far stronger than sorry. Jesus sees the man in his affliction, sees him in his need, and he's moved in the very depths of his being. The closest word we would have for it is he's filled with compassion. Jesus sees the plight of the man and says, of course I want to be healed. The of course matters, doesn't it? The of course matters. Because what that says there is not, oh gee, are you going to make up your mind here, Jesus? Will you feel this way or will you feel that way? Will you want to heal me or not? Do you care about me or don't you? The of course says that's not the issue here. That Jesus says, of course I do, says that his continual will, his consistent attitude, the way that he always feels about us is that he wants to show us his compassion. He wants to show us how much he loves and cares for us, that he wants to meet us in our need. That's always his stance towards us. Jesus is never looking at you going, well, today you might get it if you're lucky, or no, maybe not. Now, that does raise the question of when we're physically ill and why some people can experience physical healing through prayer and some don't. And that's a mysterious thing. Okay, as to why some of those prayers are answered and why those prayers sometimes aren't. But what I want you to take away from this is that this instance, this experience, this story of Jesus and the leper tells us something fundamental about Jesus' stance towards us, and therefore God's stance towards us, is that he is moved with compassion for us when we are struggling, when we're experiencing pain, when we're hurting or suffering. It doesn't have to be a physical illness. It can be whatever kind of emotional or social or physical need that we have. Jesus' desire there is for us. He's moved with compassion for us. And in a very real sense, his desire is always to heal us too. Now, sometimes that healing is the ultimate healing of what we call salvation. You know, that word salvation sounds like such a church kind of word. It's a word that we associate with our faith. Okay, in a few moments we'll say in the creed that Jesus died for our salvation. But you know, when someone like St Paul first used that word, he was borrowing from ordinary human life. The word salus, from which we get the word salvation, is the word for like a salve. You know, we talk about when we put an ointment on somebody, a salve. It's the same word. It was just the word for healing. It was the word for experiencing healing. So when Jesus heals, it tells us that salvation will ultimately be the restoration of all things. That ultimately all things will be made new, that suffering will be no more, that trial and heartache and pain and grief, that these things will ultimately be healed, restored, and we will experience the fullness of what we were always intended to experience. And that is the perfect, unconditional love of God. We won't experience that in its fullness this side of heaven, but we absolutely can start to experience it now. When somebody's healed physically now, it's a sign of all of our destinies, where one day all things will be in Christ, where there will be no tears, there will be no physical sickness. Everything will be as it shall be. That's what salvation is. Everything will be whole. All shall be healed. So, that leaves us with a question today about what are we going to do about that? About this beautiful vision that tells us what Jesus is like with us, about what he wants for us. I want you to remember today the of course, that Jesus' consistent will for you and for me is that we would know that he's for us, that he wants to meet us, that he wants to bring us healing, please God, the physical healing of right now, but also, and more importantly, the spiritual healing of heart, of soul, that reaches its fulfillment in heaven. So what are we to do with that? I think it's really important that we take the stance of the leper, but this time we might say, well, we know what you want. You've told us, Jesus. Please heal us. Please heal us. Please meet us, as it were, in our lives and in our hearts with the love and the saving power that you have. Meet us there. But I want you to do that with great confidence that Jesus' consistent will towards you is that you will be whole. That's what he wants for you.